You're listening to the Flex Success podcast, where we teach you how to be less shit.
I'm your co-host Lizzie, and this is Dean. We'll be covering all topics relating to health, fitness, and bodybuilding.
Join us as we use our in the trenches experience and up-to-date science to provide you with information that you can actually use.
If you like what we do, be sure to give us a like, follow, share, and tag us on social media.
We are back with another Flex Success podcast. Obviously, if you're listening and you hear my voice in your ears, that's where you are. So, no surprises there. Today, I'm joined by Flex Coach George, mate. Welcome, as always.
How is everyone? Implying you.
I'm not sure if they're answering or if you're asking everyone as being me, but mate, I'm fantastic. I can't complain. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, man. Enjoying the old decorating and reno life in my spare time, which seems like that's all my spare time consists of now. Any minutes you get, do shit in the house.
Well, I mean, this is, a personal update opportunity for you, mate. Have we updated people on the pod since you returned from Japan and whatnot, that you're in a new house? I don't think so.
Well, for those that don't know, me and Zoe decided to make the smart decision to buy a house at the end of the year. About a week we completed purchase before we traveled to Japan, and then spent just over 2 weeks total there before coming home to a new house, just right on the brink of Christmas, like the 23rd we got back. So it was all chaos. The end of 2024 was just complete utter chaos, everything all over the place. Didn't know whether I wanted a shit shave or a haircut, to coin an English phrase there. And yeah, now we're kind of settled, and now the fun stuff begins, which is time consuming and stuff that I'm not very skilled at. I will be honest. DIY is not my thing. These GH fingers are not good with little screws and
Not IKEA furniture. Stay away from the IKEA furniture.
Kills me. Lower back pain from sitting on the floor trying to get underneath everything. It's just not made for it.
It's the lower back for me for stuff like that than it is anything else, because you're always in awkward positions, but. And then the other thing too, man, you realize very quickly, right? Because you've also got a garden, as the UK lot would call it, not a backyard, but a garden. Is that you're like, fuck, now I need like a mower, but like, do I really want a lawnmower for this amount of grass? So do I go for a push mower? Maybe I could, but then I need to buy a rake because I need to clean that shit up. And
yeah. First world problems, but these are all problems I've not had to endure yet, so it's all new territory. And that outside, I can wait till spring, summer. I'm not touching that in the winter. Our UK winter is just so wet that anything I did out there would just create more mess.
Yeah, fair. I said to Zoe, I'm looking forward to coming over, and I'm like, for a barbecue, and she said, yeah, we've got to get that yet. And I'm like, yeah, one, like, no, I've strictly told George he needs 2 types of barbecues.
Yeah, we've got to have it, and it's got to be there before you come back over.
Yeah, barbecue up, mate.
Yeah.
Hopefully a bit of a quick podcast today, but as a podcast that was inspired by 2 things. I know you and I catch up occasionally, and you were talking about you were talking to a client of yours about some training variables and where I suppose like the level of importance of certain variables sit in the grand scheme of the discussion of hypertrophy. Things like what effect does range of motion have? What effect does something like rest periods or form? Does form really matter? Like we had this big push for length and bias partials, and now maybe some indications that it's not always as important as some people may have alluded to, and blah, blah, blah. So there's that. And then also I did a post not long ago on perhaps time under tension not being as important as what some people may suggest as well. So I thought we'd just dig into a couple of the variables today and discuss where they sit contextually within the importance of hypertrophy, because I think that's probably like the conversation that's missed. Like I listen to these podcasts and you hear people like, form's not important, but they don't really ever say like, they'll say it's not important for hypertrophy. Maybe we could argue this, but then the context is of like, but what about all of these considerations? Or the same, like if you're I'll see posts like, if you're being told to rest for less than 2 minutes, you're wasting your time because you need to be able to lift more load. I'm like, but that doesn't account for this factor and this factor and this factor and this factor. Like no one's saying rest is absolutely necessary, but maybe it controls for some factors. So where do we want to kick this off, George?
I mean, the thought kind of stemmed from a paper that was looked into by Mena Helmsman, which is where the concept client of mine piqued her interest. That was just stating something that I think is somewhat relatively obvious in that the big important rocks, if we were to label it like rocks, pebbles, and sand, are that the primary mechanisms that drive hypertrophy is mechanical tension and progressive overload. Like that's what the paper was essentially summarizing. In that, what people have perhaps misconstrued from this is that of lesser importance doesn't equal to no importance, and people obviously run with this idea of the extreme. And I think I agree, obviously, completely that the primary driver is, of course, within the progressive overload. Without that factor, all else falls apart. But that doesn't then take away from nuance, which you find across the board most of the time does apply in some of these avenues, whether it's form, range of motion, rest periods, exercise order. You're typically dealing with some of this with each client as you roll through progression, and finding that once the bigger 80% is done, these other small that may accumulate to 20% actually become relatively important, providing the prerequisite is that the main stimulus is there and prescribed.
Mm. Yeah, I think like a lot of these variables afford you the opportunity of predictability. This is one factor, and consistency of progression is another factor. Measurability would be another factor. Now, all of these things are still like predicated on the necessity of, as you mentioned, more tension or exposure to more tension over time, which is going to sound oxymoronic for me to say that, given that I just said maybe time under tension is not as important, but I'll unpick that later on. But all of these things, I think, are like opportunities for you to standardize and drive predictability, and like that's all really bodybuilding is. It's like the ability to just relentlessly go through repetitions of food, repetitions of training, repetitions of actions, but doing it in a manner that we know, like if you actually see progression on the scale or on the bar, I should say more specifically, like if we're saying load drives growth exceptionally well, and it does, or proximity to failure drives growth exceptionally well, and it does, and maybe they're the two primary factors. How do we know if that was this like actually progressed in a manner that was similar to previous? Or are we just changing things? Like, did you change form? Did you change tempo or whatnot? So standardization is the thing that I think that is super important for these.
Yep. No, absolutely. I also think we see these novice beginner trainees come in and they can literally pick up a dumbbell and throw it around in the most atrocious form possible, and they will put on size. They will get bigger. They will see adaptation. So again, kind of comes back to that. Maybe there's some things that are more important than others. But that said individual is probably going to start to run into issues because it's not all about muscle. There's also a lot of other integrities that we must consider for the other soft peripheral tissues around, say, joint attachments, ligaments, tendons as well, that needs to be maintained and also needs to adapt over time. And we also have an understanding that that's far less in time comparatively to how quickly we can recover muscle damage, and adaptations driven in that form. So form does essentially open up a conversation for prevention of injury risk and mitigation, which outside of standardizing is also something to consider, because if you can't string together years of consistent training because you're always getting injured because your form's terrible, well, then we're hitting a plateau where then you can't progressively overload. So now the big thing is not happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was like that paper, and even some of the length and stuff that people are talking about now is that most of these things exist on a spectrum too. Like the difference between going through, a full excursion of knee flexion of, 30 degrees through to 170 degrees versus doing 50 to 160 is you're probably not going to see much difference. But if you're a person who's just doing a little curtsy sort of knee bounce, then that's a little bit different too. So again, like these absolute claims of, maybe range of motion isn't as important as thought previously. Yeah, when we're talking about within a range that's relatively in close proximity to each other. So you mentioned form, man. So like let's unpick what factors of form do you think are critically important for people to recognize with regards to training and hypertrophy long term? Because I think form encompasses range of motion too, realistically.
Yeah. So I think, range of motion is a consideration within form. I think control of the weight, which is something that comes back into form, is when you're watching form feedback, you'll see how people move, and their tempo and range of motion can sometimes give you clues to this when you're watching that form feedback, where you'll see the weight drop. Like you see that loss of tension, you see that transition that occurs away from primary muscle target to secondary, tertiary, or just simply gravity that and your tendons and ligaments are catching this at the end, say on a press, as I'm doing for the example for those watching. So it's also about control of load. It's about moving the load with the target muscle and form via just a simple proximity of physics. If we slow down movement, we can get a better grasp of what's happening and use the muscles as intended. So slowing down form, slowing down tempo is typically going to give people a better understanding of learning connection to neurological connection to muscles, as well as limiting injury, of course.
Mm. And how much of a level of importance would you place on full range of motion in this instance?
I think full range of motion. So again, like where are we talking full range of motion? Are we talking top end full range of motion, bottom end and the length from full range of motion? Because there's different kind of answers to those questions. I think of importance, maybe lesser in the form conversation. I'd probably say like within form, I think the range of motion is maybe less important because we can argue nuance for where it might be more applicable to bias a bit more here or a bit more there, depending on exercise selection. If we're separating them up, I'd still put form above range of motion, as in how you move the weight rather than how far you travel with that load relative to joint axes. Um, yeah, I'd probably put it underneath.
Yeah, form's a tough one because it it's not arbitrarily defined to be the same thing for everyone because everybody has slightly varied biomechanics. And then obviously machine is dependent upon that too. Like if you're someone that has like somewhat longer femurs or tibias and you're on a leg press, it's going to look very different to somebody who has shorter tibias on a leg press. And then it's going to look even different again on a different leg press, depending on how that leg press is angled and whatnot. And the other tough thing about form, I suppose, to discuss is like a lot of what you're talking about to begin with here is the ability to understand internally like what is happening or like what is being used or to have internal intent. Like people will refer to it colloquially as like the mind muscle connection. And then I think I've heard people like argue the other way around, like it's not the mind to the muscle but the muscle to the mind or some shit like that. But that's a learned skill. And the thing that people need to recognize, and where I would say form is very important, is in early phase exercise execution, is because it's super easy to learn new skills from good form, but it's very difficult to unlearn bad form. And what form is going to at least afford you the opportunity to do is, like we mentioned once, minimize the risk for injury long term. And then two, it's at least if you go through like a full excursion of like active range of motion, technically you should be at least targeting the tissue that you're intending. So if you're trying to grow your bicep and you know how to do a proper bicep curl, biomechanically speaking, then you're likely going to have like a pretty good response. What are there any exercises off the top of your head, actually, out of curiosity, that you find people do poorly most consistently?
I think anything kind of hamstring related. I think hamstring curls are typically one that comes up for me in that people equate stretch and potentially stretch through tendons, ligaments, and nerves to feelings of the muscle stretching, and thus will overextend in the bottom of the eccentric. Like on a laying ham curl, that's the most common one I see, where they get close to hyperextending the knee because they think they're getting more stretch, more range of motion through the muscle belly, but that transfer of force has probably shifted from muscle to other peripheral tissue.
Yeah, or for some reason raising toes on an RDL, which is
Yes.
the exact same thing that you've just alluded to. Yeah, they're one that I see all the time, especially when people are trying to get them through full range. They're usually pretty good on the eccentric, and if it goes a little too far, it's not ideal. But almost always, people use their hips to shift into like what they think to be shortening of the hamstrings more so than anything else. I think that's one, and there's a lot of people out there with underdeveloped hamstrings. Actually, this is maybe an argument for like the importance of form, to be fair, because the exercises that you see people fuck up a lot on are not by surprise to me the muscles that a lot of people don't grow very well. Like it's more difficult, I think, to press really poorly than it is to probably pull with intent. Uh, you know,
I'd say.
well, and there's more involved in a pull. You've got a lot more musculature involved. It's also a lot easier to extend your knee in a machine because it's just one single joint than it is for somebody to do a very effective hamstring curl.
Yeah,
you know,
no,
because the
absolutely.
hamstrings are biarticulate. Um, the only one that I would say like is a bit different to that is maybe biceps, because I think there's a lot of people that have really good biceps that still train them really poorly with regards to form, like a lack of awareness as to like the relationship between their upper arm and their shoulders, and things just move all over the place sometimes, but somehow people still grow biceps. But hamstrings are probably the biggest one. I would agree.
That or delts, lateral delts, like even just the simplest movement like a dumbbell raise, they seem to. I know there's obviously very specific biomechanics person to person that can change that, absolutely. But for the most part, there's too much diaphragm, too much spinal flex extend movement happening within these movements to keep stimulus where it needs to really be, and it ends up
Hmm.
being a lot more, or in some really weird cases, rear delt.
Yeah. I would also say that form is probably more important for hypertrophy for you if you have a muscle that after multiple years of attempting to train it has not really shifted that much. Um,
So if we
because
stripped away what you're saying is, if we stripped away genetics and we look at someone who just isn't responsive and we want to get the muscle to grow and respond well, we're not just trying to get them stronger. We also then go, let's look at form, let's look at range of motion, let's look at rest times. So now all these other things that aren't important
you
are
go
how we're
back
going
to
to
them.
try and get this. Yeah, these
This
are
this
yeah.
is the interesting thing, right? Is you start training, like you said, you might just sling some weight around. Maybe you get lucky and you've got really good technique. And maybe you've even got pretty good technique across most movement patterns. I would argue that I've probably had fairly reasonable technique across most movement patterns, right? However, after multiple years of training, it became very apparent to me that my legs would grow quite comfortably. My hamstrings would grow accordingly to my quads. My chest would grow when I wanted it to. My shoulders would for sure grow, even if I tried them not to. And my arms kind of just came along for the ride. But one thing that really struggled was my back. And it's also the one thing that I really struggled to have that internal connection with, as you mentioned, with the exercises that were available to me in the past. Now, this is a conversation that I suppose that then shifts into exercise selection, in that the original old school, like, 90s through to early 2000s are going to say, like, we've gotten too far away from the bread and butter of back training. Where are the heavy barbell rows? Where are the heavy dumbbell rows? Where are the heavy seated rows? And I'm like, well, they existed in my world when I started. And I grew a lot of arms and I grew a lot of rear delt and I grew a moderate amount of back. And then as time's progressed and I've learned, maybe I might be better at engaging my lats by doing a single arm pull down, for example. I learned then that I could actually get some internal focus, which then allowed me to get some internal torque. That torque then allowed me to engage the muscle that I was actually trying to use. And surprise, surprise, George, that shit grew a lot more. So exercise selection for me for back was incredibly important for growth. Now, it wasn't the exercise selection itself that grew more tissue. It was then the progressive overload of it. But without the appropriate exercise, the progressive overload would just generally then go to another muscle group.
Yeah,
Mm.
completely. I had the same thing with my quad training. Could never get my quads to grow. Was always doing all the traditional things, leg extensions, lunges, barbell, squats constantly until I got on a very good hip dominant leg press and a very good hack squat or pendulum. I didn't really see the same growth or response in my quads, but I also didn't feel them. I like it was the one muscle group. I was like, fuck, I feel my back. I feel this. I feel that. I can train. I get a pump. Legs, I'm doing all the heavy loading. Weight's going up, but nothing's really changing.
Yeah. I mean, it didn't matter what I would pull. I'd be like, why are my rear delts so pumped? Like they should be, but like, how are they moving all this weight? But also, what's funny, man? Like I'll see some other people like, man, they can move some load with that pull. But then I look at them and I can just see like lats and mid traps and upper traps just doing like this. That there's full like protraction of the scap, there's full retraction, and then I'll do mine, and I'm like, I can just tell that is all being loaded through my delts, and that's why I'm also not that strong with my back, because I'm actually pulling with my fucking rear delts, not my lats. Dirty
Yeah,
bastards. And then similarly, I would say like tempo, while it itself is not going to directly change the stimulus with regards to hypertrophy, in that, you could lift fast, you can lift slow. Both of them will achieve the same theoretical outcome in regards to growth. For me, tempo is more about what we talked about before. It's making exercises less injurious. It's standardizing the actual progression of load and or reps. And it's affording you the opportunity to have very good internal focus if you do it at a tempo that is just sufficient. Where I think tempo gets lost is when tempo is used as a reason in of itself to cause more fatigue and or pain for the sake of feeling like the exercise does more. and then it's limiting load to the point where the tension actually placed through that tissue would be quite insignificant. So it could potentially be counterproductive to growth long term.
Kind of like a length and partial on a dumbbell side raise. It's just like,
Yes.
Okay, not really achieving much here, bar just maybe irritating the joint and the trap, getting a bit of a pump. But yeah, no, tempo, I'd agree for the most part. And I think for me, tempo is a method of intensification in certain individuals when stubborn muscle groups come up as unresponsive. Then I start to manipulate and play a bit more. But usually, anywhere from that 1 to 3 second eccentric is more than adequate, providing that you are engaged, in control, and lowering that weight in the eccentric, as opposed to, or yeah, whatever way we're looking at it, or instead dropping said load and not controlling it, right? So tempo can just be a way to engage people more, so they're teaching them how to learn and feel their muscles again, right? It comes back to, again, for me, that neurological stimulus. Like tempo can be a way to help people engage, slow it down. But for the most part, not like this pinnacle importance.
Yeah, I think like eccentric tempo, the lengthening part portion of it should be sufficient to control, and no slower deliberately, unless the asterisk is that you need to do that for a specific reason, like injury, or you're trying to actually minimize load because you're so fucking strong. Like, like doing an RDL with 320 kilos at 2 seconds, maybe you could do it at 3 or 4 and just do it with 280, just to sort of, again, for the purpose of making it less injurious.
Yeah, and then that kind of nice bow wrapped around it was, as you said, it may be specific to movement pattern and resistance profile. Like you're going to manipulate your tempo to maybe suit a resistance profile, like a 2-0-X1 suits really well on a side dumbbell side lateral raise. You're not going to do a 3-2-1 on a dumbbell side lateral raise.
No, imagine a 5 second like eccentric from a side lateral raise. It's like, man, that shoulder is not meant to be under load in that position for that amount of time.
No, tendons and ligaments are going to start hurting.
You're like, has anyone ever? I always think that when you see these slow side laterals, have you ever looked at a shoulder joint? Like the only thing holding it in place is tendons and ligaments.
That's
like,
why the forearm pain from those really slow.
Take your hip though, like, man, you could hang that thing out with a bunch of weight on it, like a bird trying to get its wing weighted for length and partial growth. Like that hip's going to hang on for a long time. But what other factors are there, George, if any?
Rest times in between. Now, again, I guess if we're trying to value the importance in regard to progressive overload, obviously, I don't think rest periods are that important, and I think it's just an incredibly nuanced topic of conversation. It comes down to I like Dr. Mike's overview of rest times, looking at 4 sections and being like, primary muscle group, secondary and tertiary muscle groups, nervous system, respiratory tract. Are all 4 of those things back in a position to do another hard set to the intensity prescribed within the rep range prescribed. If all 4 meet that criteria, have at it, good to go. And that can range from 60 seconds, sometimes 30 if an intensifier is in there or whatever else, but usually 60 to 120, maybe just over for most. It doesn't really matter too much if you're rushing your rest times a little. Like, I have clients all the time that, I rushed through this session a little bit. I didn't really feel like I got the most out of it. And then you look at their numbers, and although the rest times might have been shorter, and understanding that their form was kept and carried across and they weren't rushing their form, they still drove adaptation, even though they rested shorter. They still progressed on all lifts as intended. So it wasn't really playing into the session performance that much.
Rest time is an interesting one for me because I put rest times on a lot of my exercises for most of my guys, unless it's like really heavily load focused. Like I want them to become absolutely stronger for a movement pattern. I'll just be like, rest as long as you need, right? Which really like accounts for those factors that you just mentioned from Dr. Mike. But I also like standardizing rest for a couple of reasons. One, I think progressive overload and tension is obviously incredibly important for growth. I think there is an element somewhat that needs to be considered about like metabolic demand for growth, because there's some exercise modalities that suggest that would be beneficial for growth, like occlusion training, for example, or even if you look at anaerobically dominant athletes that aren't doing a ton of heavy loading, they still can get a lot of muscle growth just from the sheer demand. I would posit a guess from like improving mitochondrial biogenesis. Technically, then you'd have more androgen receptors, you could maybe grow more tissue. Like I think there's a component to the metabolic stress there that may have some importance. So sometimes doing some exercises on a shorter rest period with high repetitions that sort of demand that sort of energy system to like really go into overdrive might be advantageous. I just don't think it should be a massive component of your training programming, So like resting for the purpose of having a particular adaptation or a specific adaptation makes sense to me. And then like outside of that, I don't know if it really like it's super important other than again to standardize progression, probably.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I think the importance opens up when you start getting into more specific context and nuance.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. And also like maybe just because it stops people from just like spending a long, long, long fucking time in the gym, to be honest. Um,
That is another thing.
you know, because like here's if we only focus solely on just load and progression, and we said like here's an opportunity to do 15 sets in a workout, and you literally rested for like if you legitimately rested to like completely cover off those factors that you mentioned before, you'd be taking 5 minute rests on every set.
I can put some personal anecdote on that realistically because there was a point in time in my bodybuilding where I was trying to blow my legs up and I genuinely thought, right, I've tried everything, let's nail every single 1%. And one of the things that I massively was looking into was my rests in between sets. And don't get me wrong, I put loads of strength on in that time frame, but I didn't see any arguable difference in my growth potential from going all in on every nice niche variable, like ironing out to the fucking finest degree compared to me now going in and training my quads. It doesn't make the rest time didn't really impact my progression or size change in any real noticeable way when I compare back off season to off season.
Do you mean negatively or positively?
Either or, it didn't really change anything. I may have seen slightly higher load progressions on the overview of that off season where I went all in and nailed every variable, but I don't think it's equated entirely to like this obvious change in my muscularity just because of that rest change in the variable.
Mm. Yes, yeah, so I think this is actually one of the major things that people don't discuss in these kinds of
Just
discussions.
for context on that one quickly, Dean, I was repeating that same block for basically two whole off seasons. My legs needed that much work, so it was like a consistent comparison. It was the same.
Yeah. No, but the point is going to be is like, okay, you could say take an individual, have them rest as long as they need on a leg press to achieve as much progression as they possibly can. Take the same individual, give them a minute rest period of time, have them do the same amount of sets and compare those. And you may actually, I would say it would likely be the case that you would probably see in this isolated case more growth in option A because their capacity to do more is greater because they've rested for longer. However, take now option B and repeat option B for the next 6 months. Option B is now no longer actually rightfully being compared to option A because the progression is now being taken contextually on the week to the week to the week to the week to the week, which is exactly what you've just spoken about. Is that I'll just say under no rest parameters, you grew X amount. When you immediately shifted to maybe shorter rest, you may have technically had a lower stimulus because your capacity to do the same amount of work was less. But then as you repeat that and you standardize, now the progression only becomes contextually relevant to the week prior. And I think this is the thing that people fuck up a lot. And even in that discussion, maybe from men, it was like, in isolation, this doesn't matter, but in comparison from this week to this week to this week for the next 6 months, what really does matter? And it's your capabilities or your capacity to do this thing that you're trying to do, which is grow tissue repeatedly over and over and over again with the lowest risk profile for injury. So maybe resting is actually a particular time is advantageous for you. Last but not least is I suppose like it all kind of encompasses this was that conversation around like time under tension because it is one thing that is pushed I think still a little bit, but again like maybe is misunderstood in that the time specifically spent under tension is less important than the actual tension itself. And maybe we could say like something that might be a little bit more, like for example, I don't think doing 5 second negatives versus doing 3 second negatives has any like appreciable difference in muscle hypertrophy. Five probably hurts more. I certainly don't think doing 10 seconds is advantageous. Now, if you've been doing 3 your entire life, and then you do 10-second eccentrics for a period of time that creates a novel stimulus, maybe that does some growing for you. But it's the novelty that has done that, not necessarily the 10 seconds itself. And I think that's maybe where this time under tension gets thrown out. But the time is less important than the tension. Time should be predicated more so on the things that we've spoken about for the rest of this podcast. Time is determined by how well you execute through what range of motion under a controlled eccentric concentric movement. And that's how much time you should spend on tension. And
Pretty
then
much.
technically do more sets and it's more time under tension too.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like,
And I think the degree that changes is people think like, controlling weights. And this will come from people that apply those parameters we spoke about. They probably have an issue with a stubborn muscle group. They then put more tempo or time under tension into their eccentric or whatever part of the phase. They get the result, and now they attest their progression to the change in tempo, not just the fact that this was a nuance to them that they just needed to specifically engage better with their own genetic pool that they were left with.
yeah. So I think there the argument is like, yeah, so time under tension does matter. It's like, yes, it matters for the purpose of execution. It is not specifically itself stimulating more hypertrophy.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
and it's that differentiation between what the study was saying and what people are taking from it. Yeah.
exactly. These
Or
things
just
do not matter for the stimulation of hypertrophy. However, they matter for your ability to generate growth over time for the reasons that we've discussed in this pod.
what about just general exercise order in a session then? I can make an argument kind of against and for, in that for me, with unorthodox programming specific to bodybuilding, it might not be the most functional when you look at it on paperwork and you think about how the human anatomy moves, but this is what we need to do to achieve the end goal of specifically growing this one isolated space. So, like, yeah, there's more injury risk with bodybuilder isolated kind of contracted setup of training programming. But I find this like this. The reason I say that is because I find this battle between some coaches that really, from the biomechanics kind of group, that put a large degree of doesn't matter about what you're trying to bias, you can do so and keep the body moving functionally, and they believe like there should be an order to how we operate. And then you have us in the really bodybuilder centric, where we kind of throw that out the book and go, we're not trying to be functional and throw like CrossFit parameters above our heads. We're trying to build muscle, and in order to achieve that, this is what looks best in that unorthodox template. Sometimes hitting all your delt work here before you do your chest work. Most likely wouldn't be done if we're thinking functionally, but it makes sense for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I probably have like an idea in my brain as to like what I think is an optimal setup for maximizing performance through a muscle tissue. But it doesn't mean that I write a program that way, because then I have to look at the individual and go like, is it advantageous to give somebody 3 sets of leg extensions on a 30-second rest period before they go and squat? Not if they want to squat maximally. But I'm not really worried if they can squat to their maximum capacity. I'm worried if they can squat in a manner that generates the most amount of quad hypertrophy with the lowest amount of risk of injury repeatedly for the next 6 weeks. That's what I care about. So like the load, again, if you were to compare this session to session or squat to squat, the stimulus of the squat following the leg extension is lower, technically, because it's under less load, under less tension. So comparison to comparison, week to week, sure, you could argue that may be a bad choice. But I'm never having them sometimes squat first and sometimes squat second. They're always going to squat second. So it's squatting second in week 1 versus week 2 versus week 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But dude, you bring up an interesting point, because there was like when I first started out and I came from like the exercise science background that was all about sports performance, like should you have a certain ratio of push to pull, and should your hamstrings be a relative strength to your quads, like all of this shit. I was like, yeah, that's all important. And you build these programs out, and then you're like, okay, so they've got 45 minutes worth of stuff to make sure that they're ready. And then what? Then I've got to get in the requisite amount of like volume to now drive growth. This is a big session, but it is what it is. And then I went probably a little bit, like always, the pendulum went a little bit too far, and I was like, you know what? I'm trying to isolate like a lot of pec growth here. So back would get once a week, legs would get once a week, and they'd be doing pressing 3 times a week. And it would be amazing for growth. But I would find that after about 2 or 3 rotations, some shit started to fall off. The shoulders would get a bit jammy, the elbows would get a bit sore. Maybe injury prevention was starting to become more difficult to manage. And I was like, oh, okay, like there's only so long that you can truly specify, before you run into some problems. So then I'll be like, all right, well, it's important that when I'm programming you as your bodybuilding coach, that I'm programming for the outcome of maximum growth in this muscle. Your responsibility as the athlete is to do the other work to functionally ensure that you stay, healthy.
Yeah,
so I think like you can still have a very asymmetrical program that is very specific to growing a particular muscle group, so long as you still do the functional stuff, but I think you can probably get away with the functional stuff. It does, I don't think it has to necessarily be done like all the time, you know.
Yeah.
James, your client, may argue here. He'd be actually a fun person to talk to about this because I'm
Yeah,
sure
so
he'd have alarm bells going. Listen here, motherfucker, but you can't just work in the
yeah,
sagittal plane 24/7. Like, well, I actually can, but and this
yeah,
is where he would argue. Like I would say, like we would say, or maybe I won't speak for you. I would say, like, I don't really care about the functional stuff because I'm caring about growth. And then he would say, yeah, but if you don't do the functional stuff, how long can you do the specific stuff for before you injure yourself? And I'm like, that's a good point. So like,
there we go.
you know, exercise order doesn't matter for growth, but it really does long term.
Yeah. Now, I find again, context and nuance apply as always. For the most part, I'm exactly on your path there, Dean. Like, again, that ain't the goal right now. We're not trying to go do a CrossFit meet. I understand you need to be able to pick things up off the floor as you age. You need to put things above your head, but you're going to be able to achieve that from doing the training that we're doing. You might, have to rotate the cycle of specialization to maybe more balanced progression just to manage injury risk. But that kind of specific programming with functionality in mind, like you said, like anterior to posterior on the body. That comes up when you're dealing with cases where it's like, oh, okay, no, we've seen this potential niggle injury start to overlap. Let's take a look into that, and maybe programming for you has that consideration. But for the most part, bodybuilding is what we're aiming for.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I know that I have to program, for example, for Cam Witters, we have to keep in a form of a lunge most of the time. Otherwise, his like knees and his hips and his back and stuff just start to get a bit funky. Like he needs some asymmetrical loading that requires to have some balance. Otherwise, shit goes out, and then he can't do his other leg training. So like it's super necessary for him to do that. But I think like too, like in the absence of injury, in the absence of problems, you can probably have a specialization block repeatedly for an entire growth phase, so long as you don't get caught in then thinking that this is the way that you then continue to program and you shift up some of that movement pattern in the phase that is less important for hypertrophy, like a maintenance phase or a recovery phase or whatever you call that phase. And that's when you can gain back some of the functionality.
I was going to say, something that I see as a common trend for me is that obviously with the parameters of like deficit training considerations, that we're probably going to want to drive in some more acute stimulus to areas of the physique that don't normally get specific targeted stimulus. So we might change that specialization to more of what I'd call a prioritization in my words, where we still bias the improvement, but now there's a bit more considerations that anterior posterior shift between and upper to lower balance as well as push to pull balance, so forth. But then it's specific to like, well, I'm actually doing this not really for your I'm doing this because I want to maintain all your muscle mass in the best possibility during this deficit. So it's like,
yeah, like there's been an extended period of time there without stimulating that particular tissue. Now you get the novelty of that back. So anyway, sorry.
The hypertrophy, probably just an agreement that it's just one of those things. It's nuanced.
Yeah, I suppose the take home message for me, or like the be less shit tip here, is don't get caught in the isolated thinking that one thing is the answer for hypertrophy. Like all of these things matter to a degree, but they're largely all working in unison with each other to achieve the greatest possible outcome. No one of them is important, but the sum of all parts, I think, generates a much better result.
Yeah, and for those that are doing the bigger rocks, that 90% of progressive overload intention, these little things afterwards do start to add up to your accumulated net outcome. So it is probably quite important that you focus on all of the pebbles, rocks, and sand, not just the bigger rocks, and throw the pebbles and sand out.
Yeah, and you said this already, but I'm going to say it again too. Like, even though load and progressive overload is likely, I'll say likely, I won't say is because we don't want to be so definite, likely the most, the greatest contributor to hypertrophy. If you've already been doing that and a muscle isn't growing, then you have to strip it back and start back with these things that apparently don't matter. So you may as well do them now and start, because eventually you're gonna have to anyway. So
Exactly.
All right, George. Sorry, what was that?
Start as you mean to continue.
There you go. That's the be less shit tip in a pithy little line, mate. George, we have a new, I was going to say category, but that is incorrect. We have a new portion to the podcast now where there's 11 rapid fire questions at the end. I'm not going to try and attempt a would you rather on you at the end of this one because I don't want to have the people listening for 35 seconds while I think of something worth it. But I've answered these rapid questions. It is now your turn. First answer that comes to your mind. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Scrunch or fold?
Fold.
Coke or Pepsi?
Pepsi.
Bottom or top?
In what context? Uh, uh, top.
I feel like I saw your lips purse for bottom so many times.
Yeah, because I'm on the fence.
Bottom.
One specific situation. It depends. There's so many questions now from that one.
I'm trying to
Ugh.
think about what other situations bottom or top is relevant, but whatever.
Bunk
Sleeping on a
beds.
bunk. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, what do you do? We'll never know, George. Pineapple on pizza, yes or no?
Yes.
Shoes too big or too small?
Too big.
Dogs or cats?
Dogs.
Relaxing resort holiday or action-packed adventure?
Action-packed adventure all day.
Toast or cereal?
Oh, toast. Toast.
Good choice. Nut butter, crunchy or smooth?
Smooth. Smooth. If I want nuts, I'll have crunchy. I'll have hard nuts.
As opposed to soft one?
Well, okay. Yeah, all right. If
Oh, I
anyone can
know what
find
you mean.
out, let me know.
You can't spread a crunchy nut butter, but a crunchy nut butter is better on top of things. Yeah. All right. Peed on by a stranger or pooed on by a baby?
Well, I mean, one of them probably happened after a night out. So I'll go with put on by a baby.
Okay. And last but not least, noisy eater or heavy nose breather, which is worse?
Fuck them both. I'm gonna say breather. There's more opportunities for that to be annoying.
Yeah. I think. Oh, I don't even remember some of my answers to these, but I feel like they'd switch each week depending on what I've been exposed to.
Silly. I think with the
uh,
baby, fairness, the baby doesn't have much choice in its involuntary actions, so I'm not going to be as pissed off unless a random stranger decides to piss on me, and I'm going to be a little bit annoyed.
yeah, that would be something to take in, wouldn't it? Neither of those are a good scenario.
No.
Mate, thank you very much for getting on. Always an enjoyable chat. Any final words for anyone or anything exciting you're looking forward to in 2025?
Another full-on comp season, man. Let's get it.
Yeah, man, you and me both. So thanks for listening, everybody. As always, give us a like and share, 5-star review. We don't take fours, only fives. And for anyone sharing content, please give us a tag. Thanks for listening.